Yeah, playing.
See ya. Okay.
Fort Freemont closes out a 350 years of coastal fortifications beginning in the mid-16th century. It also represents America's coastal defense system before the dawn of air power. Fort Fremont is an example of the most advanced military technology of its time. It would parallel the B-17, an aircraft carrier of World War II, the F-35 of today. Fort Fremont was an important part of the Harris Island and the Marine Corps Air Base today.
In 1525, the Spaniards named this sound and this harbor Santa Elena. They called the navigational point La Punta de Santa Elena, the point of Santa Elena. And what the Spanish explorers discovered is that Port Royal Sound is a unique piece of geography. It's the deepest natural harbor south of the Chesapeake Bay, possibly south of New York. The channel into Port Royal Sound, this I find a remarkable geological fact. The channel has not changed for 500 years. There's no inlet on the southern coast that hasn't shifted entirely in 500 years, except Port Royal Sound. There's something geologically different, or one might say magical, about Port Royal Sound. So Spanish sailors, being the best in the world in their time, found this place very early, knew that for the Spanish explorations of the American Southeast, this would be the entrada, the entrance. And so they built a city across the river, across the sound from where we are on Parris Island. It became the first capital of Florida. And they explored the backcountry from this location for more than a century, with the object of building a highway from this magnificent harbor to Mexico City. So the sound was known to the Spaniards. It was known to the French, who actually got here first and created the first Protestant colony in the New World on Parris Island over my shoulder. And that colony was a failure. The Spaniards replaced them. It was part of Spanish Florida when the English arrived 150 years later. And this became, as a consequence, a battleground in the 18th century between Spanish interests in Florida and St. Augustine and the English colony in Carolina and in Charleston. And back and forth, these wars went, many of them naval wars, many of them employing, as all the sailors knew by then, the magic of Port Royal Sound. When the Civil War came, Confederates defended the harbor, but it was basically indefensible against large naval forces. So the U.S. Navy made it their principal target during the beginning of the Civil War and sent the largest flotilla of ships assembled by the United States Navy in the 19th century into Port Royal Sound on November 7th, 1861. In a 4-hour cannonade, which would have been deafening from where we're sitting, was heard for miles from Savannah nearly to Charleston. It was called the Day of the Big Gun Shoot. During the Civil War, this harbor that we're looking at was filled with ships. There would be hundreds of ships in this harbor. There was a 1,000-foot dock with a railroad on top off of Hilton Head. The military installation was mammoth. There were 13,000 U.S. soldiers on Hilton Head, which we're looking at. The largest population on Hilton Head until 1974. So this was a major U.S. government installation in the heart of the South. It was the headquarters of the U.S. Army Department of the South, but more importantly, it was the headquarters of the United States Navy South Atlantic Blockading Squadron. So the biggest ships in the Navy were here. And so it became, and that's really where the story of Fort Fremont starts, with that huge Civil War military operations and installations on Hilton Head, on St. Helena Island, on Parris Island, and in Beaufort.
After the Civil War, we're going to see a massive change in technology that's going to revolutionize the military. During the Civil War, we had ironclad ships, we had rifle cannons, but they were all made out of iron. They were not terribly effective. But its technology is going to change after the Civil War. We're going to see steel produced, and steel is much harder. So now we have a new material to make armor out of for ships. So we can have these armored ships made with steel that are much more resistance to shot. Because I have steel, I can make stronger barrels for my guns. I can rifle and machine these much better. And the rifling is the spirals that are cut in the barrel that allows it to shoot further with more accuracy. And we can also now have breech loading guns that can lock from behind, so I can load my gun from behind. I don't have to go the old black powder muzzle loading cannon I had before. Now I can fire much more rapidly. If I compare the gun of 1890 to the guns of 1860, for the same caliber, the same diameter gun, the 1890 gun will be able to fire a projectile that's 4 times heavier, can shoot it 3 times further, can put it in with greater precision, and can put it through much more armor than anything we had in 1860. It's a world of difference. A military historian, E.R. Lewis, would say that the change between the Civil War and 1890 in artillery technology was the greatest that would be seen since the invention of artillery in the 14th century to the introduction of the nuclear projectile in the 1950s. So there's been a huge change in gun technology. At the same time, it's not just the steel, but also the powder that fires these guns is different. Chemical makeup. And sort of like cordite is invented now, and it's still a widely used military explosive even today. Smokeless powder is invented during this period of time. And it's not just chemical composition, but it's the details of how you make the grain, how fast they burn. So much like the skill of firing a solid rocket, solid fuel rocket, it's that same kind of technology has been developed in these gunpowder, in this new powder. So our weapons of this day are much, much greater. They would be the great killing machines of World War I. Most of the casualties on the battlefields of World War I would come from artillery. So the world has seen a huge change in artillery, and that's tied into changes in ships. We now have steel armored ships. They're all steam powered. They are now equipped with these fine long-range guns, and they now become the dominant threat of the late 19th, early 20th century. This is the threat. The French and the English would bombard cities like Cairo and reduce them to rubble because they were unable to defend them. So this is how the world was seeing the threat from this new technology. Big battleships are the threat of the era, and new guns and fortifications on the ground are what you have to defend against them.
One of the most important and first things that happened after the Civil War is they built a railroad to Port Royal Sound, which didn't exist. It was the first connection of the Sea Islands to the mainland. And the advantage of that railroad is it brought coal to Port Royal Sound. So when the coal was delivered, the Navy followed.
In 1872, Robert Smalls was in the South Carolina legislature, and he pushed through a resolution to the Secretary of War calling for them to put a Navy station on Parris Island. And eventually he would go on to Congress, where he would continue his support for a Navy station here in the Beaufort-Port Royal area. They eventually opened a Navy station here and a coaling station.
They created in the 1890s on Parris Island the largest dry dock in the United States. This is the period when the U.S. Navy was switching from sail to steam. All the navies of the world need coaling station. This was the principal coaling station, because of the railroad, for the Caribbean and South American U.S. fleets.
This would be the biggest dry dock south of Norfolk. In fact, it is the only dry dock south of Norfolk, Virginia, that's capable of taking these new modern battleships and these new modern armored cruisers. So this becomes, at this point, a strategic Navy base in that it provides coal, and it provides top line support to the ships, and they can repair the hulls of even the biggest ships in the U.S. Navy. Following the Civil War, national strategy and emphasis in the United States shifted to recovery from war, and all of our coastal fortifications went into neglect. The military was busy taming the West, and coastal defenses became something that was no longer important. In the rest of the world, technology is moving forward, and they're developing these battleships, they're developing new high-quality artillery, and this is going on worldwide. And in 1885, President Grover Cleveland appointed the Endicott Board. This was headed by Secretary of War William Endicott, and the board would meet and issue a report in 1886, and it said the conditions of our coastal defenses were just unbearable. It cannot be allowed to stay like that. And they made recommendations for fortification and improvements. They identified 29 places that needed fortifications and 11 of which were critical. In that list of 29, Savannah and Charleston are on the list, but Beaufort is not on the list. It'll take international events to bring Beaufort into the play of modern fort technology.
So the USS Maine was here on patrol and in the harbor, and while they were in the harbor several times, they entertained the local population. So the merchants and the social leaders and the political leaders of Beaufort were invited to come have lunch with the captain of the ship, Captain Sigsbee. And the officers got to know the people got to know the officers. The crew, which was large, would go ashore on payday and make friends with everybody in town. So it was a very social arrangement between the towns, Port Royal and Beaufort, and the ship. So the Maine left here, it went and reprovisioned, it refueled in Key West, and then went the 90 miles across to Havana into the harbor and blew up.
This inflamed the already hot passions both in Cuba and here in the United States. At that point, somebody in the War Department realized that we had this big dry dock, the only dry dock in the South that could take on and repair these big
Ted, can you turn the volume up a little bit?
start operations against a power in the Caribbean, and this fort was totally undefended. And that's what put Fort Fremont on the map. We had to have a fort here to defend the coaling station and especially this big dry dock, as well as this fine harbor that's here.
And of course, that event, which killed 300 or more,
Yes, much better. Thank you.
Yes, thanks.
was very much followed by the local news media and very much lamented by the many friends that the crew had made here. The destruction of the USS Maine was a personal matter to Beaufort and to Port Royal Sound. And of course, it was the Spanish-American War and the attempt to defend this harbor again, which led to the creation of Fort Freeman. The United States declared war on Spain in April 1898.
And by early May, we had temporary batteries in place here. Submarine mines were in place. And in the summer, they would actually place the mines across the Beaufort River behind me. The temporary batteries were a temporary expedient. They were located to my left, about 1,000 yards. They immediately began construction of what would become Fort Fremont, the large batteries with house of large guns. Battery 4 Nance, the rapid fire guns, the smaller battery was completed by June of 1898.
In 1898, everybody in town went to war. They had a naval militia unit, South Carolina Naval Militia Unit, and they were absorbed by the Navy. Many of them ran tugboats from here to New York to Key West, which was the principal support base, Tampa and Key West, for the U.S. Army operations in Cuba.
Peace was declared by the end of 1898, and the remainder of Fort Fremont would not be finished until early 1899, and the first soldiers would arrive from the regular army at that point in March 1899.
Well, Fort Fremont was named for Major General John Fremont. He was actually a local boy, so to speak. He was born and grew up in Savannah, Georgia, just south of us, and went to college in the College of Charleston, just north of us in Charleston. He served in the Army and primarily initially as a explorer, as Army forts were generally named for Army officers, and he was connected locally. This was more than likely why the fort was named for him.
The fort was constructed on a site directly across the river from the Parris Island Naval Station. And the site selected was 170 acres, which included the two artillery batteries. Fort Fremont, of course, had Battery Fornes and Battery Jessup. But then adjacent to the battery site was an administrative quadrangle, very typical military type administrative square?
We are sitting in the number 3 gun position of a 3-gun battery Jessup, which had 3 10-inch disappearing carriage, large caliber guns, breech loading guns. Their purpose was to engage the warships that might be entering the harbor and Port Royal Sound. We're here now at the 2nd battery that was part of Fort Fremont. This is Battery Fornance, was named for Army officer that was actually killed during the Spanish-American War during the Battle of San Juan Hill. Battery Fornance mounted 2 British-made 4.72-inch Armstrong quick-fire guns. They were called quick-fire because they were loaded with a complete cartridge, and in time of action, they could fire 4 to 6 rounds per minute. The purpose of Battery Fornance was to defend the minefield, which was the other component of the Endicott Coast Artillery or Coast Defense System. A minefield with controlled mines, controlled meaning that they were connected electrically to shore and could be fired on command from shore. That control station would have been probably shared with the plotting room. And in order to protect the minefield, obviously an enemy would want to interfere with that, might send vessels, small ships in here at night to try to interfere. And this battery would take those vessels under fire if there was suspected that they were doing something to interfere with the mines, such as pulling up the cables and cutting those.
The Endicott era fort was a formidable technology. It represented state-of-the-art technology, defense technology of its time against the state-of-the-art threat, which would be the battleship.
The life for the soldiers at Fort Fremont was disciplined and regimented. They even had meal times were specified lengths of time, 15 minutes for lunch, 15 minutes at breakfast, 20 minutes at supper. They had to practice their skills. They were training and doing maintenance constantly. If you can imagine, with these big guns, they had to have skills and practice the skills in artillery, mine laying, signaling, which involved, in our case at Fort Fremont, the use of the fire control tower, which was a pretty sophisticated and advanced signaling technique. Then they also had to practice the typical military skills, marching and drilling, small arms fire, first aid, and so forth. In addition to that, they also had participated in athletics. They had physical training, PT, and they also had sports teams. So this was to keep them physically fit so that they could continue their duties, because it was pretty rigorous at Fort Fremont.
When eventually the decision was made to move the dry dock and the coaling station and the Navy station up to Charleston, then this fort no longer became significant. There was nothing left here that was to be protected. And at that point, 1911, the last troops were transferred out and the fort was closed.
In 1901, the mayor of Charleston and the United States Senator Pitchfork Penn Tillman from South Carolina wanted this to move from Beaufort County to Charleston County because there are more votes in Charleston County. And the mayor wanted the U.S. Corps of Engineers and the Navy to dredge the harbor in Charleston because battleships in those days required 26 feet of water. Charleston's natural harbor is 15 feet of water. Port Royal is 30 feet of water. In order for Charleston to sustain its port, its commercial port, it had to dredge the harbor. Well, if they could get the Navy up there, they get the Corps of Engineers to dredge the harbor. That was the play. And the play for Pitchfork Penn Tillman, the U.S. Senator in 1900, was that he'd get a whole lot more votes from the largest city in South Carolina. So it was a political, commercial operation, and they moved the nation, and it was done, boom, like that.
The fort did its job. It was a deterrent for anybody that wished to attack these. It provided protection. In fact, the whole Endicott system, although never challenged in this era here in the United States, provided some 300 major guns, coastal guns to protect major areas, and left the United States at the beginning of the 20th century with as well defended coastline as any place in the world.
I would just like to say that it's a magnificent artifact of an era. And it's an era that has been neglected. The turn of the 20th century, the naval station across the river here. And so it's a piece of history that's disappearing, and the Friends of Fort Fremont and Beaufort County have preserved it for the use of the public and as a memorial to that moment in history.
Fort Fremont closes a 350-year story of homeland security addressing European imperialism in the 19th century. It's a tale of how geography, technology, and national security creates a transition for America to become a global power. It's also a wonderful snapshot of America in the beginning of the 20th century. The Friends of Fort Fremont and Beaufort County have a valued partnership working in tandem to preserve the fort's integrity and promote the historical, natural, and cultural aspects of the fort. Most important, we're always looking for creative ways to enhance the visitor experience.
So I won't be saying. I put the soup in the crock pot, but it's not gonna be ready for a while.
All right, I just the last little credits bit and everything, I stopped at.
Ted, something.
Just to say one interesting thing, well, that's Fort Fremont and sort of the history and some pictures of it and whatever. If things happen in April, folks will be seeing that. Actually, Gary Alexander, who's the coordinator and on the staff at Fort Moultrie up in Charleston, is coming down on Monday, and we're going to talk a little bit about how we do this. And then hopefully this interpretive center, if the thing does happen in April, hopefully the interpretive center will be completed and we'll have our diorama. You saw a little brief shot of it there. The one fellow that was sitting there was the gentleman who, Dennis Kennedy, who made the diorama, and you'll be able to see that. If things don't turn out exactly that way, we might be able to stop in briefly at the library, which you probably, to get to Fort Fremont, you pretty much have to drive right by it and get to see that. So anyway, that's that. Let me just show something here that I just thought about. I don't know if folks can see this. This is something I ran across not recently, but a couple of years ago. It's a drawing of plans that the Navy, it's dated 1900, and there were plans for the Navy to triple the size of the naval station on Parris Island. They were going to build 2 more dry docks.
Ted, you need to click on something. All we're seeing is the old screen.
Oh, okay. Well, I just held that up in front of me. I just thought about this. I don't know. Can you see that? Can folks see?
No, all we're seeing is the old screen.
No, you need to stop screen sharing.
Oh, okay. Let me try to do that.
We're looking at your directory.
At the directory. Okay. Well, let me just go and get the next one, then we'll forget about that. That was just a thing. But anyway, I can just say the Navy had plans in 1900, and I've got the real piece of paper there, to triple the size of the naval station on Parris Island. They were going to build 2 more dry docks. Each of those were going to be larger than the existing dry dock, and all the other support facilities that were going to go along with that, the shops and everything else. And that would have been a major naval station, but then as it was pointed out in the video, politics got involved and everything got moved up to Charleston. Okay, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put on this next shorter thing. This is a oh, wait a minute. Okay. Now, does everybody see this?
Yes, sir.
Okay, this is also a short video that or not a video, but a PowerPoint that we sometimes use. There's a lot of interest. Well, what were the guns here like, and how did they work, sort of? There were two batteries at Fort Fremont. Battery Jessup, which had the three 10-inch disappearing carriage guns, and then Battery Four Nance, which was really part of the mine battery because its job was to defend the minefield and also to engage any smaller vessels in that regard. And just a couple of pictures of the 10-inch breech loading guns. It's very difficult to explain to folks when you're just looking at the gun pit there what one of these things really looked like and kind of how they worked. But these are the guns that might be recognized. They're up at Fort Casey, up in Puget Sound, and actually they came from the Philippines in the 60s. This is sort of some information on how these work. This was the powder magazine. This is a sort of put the virtual magazine, so to speak, or put together one. I think this was up at Fort Mott up in New Jersey with the powder cans, each one of them holding an 80-pound powder charge up in a wooden rack. And the shell magazine, which held the high explosive shells, 510 pounds each. That's actually myself there in my uniform. Shells were moved on an overhead trolley system. They're obviously too heavy to manhandle around. And the shot magazine, which held the armor piercing projectiles, 617 pounds, a little bit heavier, and again handled by an overhead trolley system. There was a power-driven hoist system, the Taylor Raymond ammunition hoist. This was the general one that was used, called the back delivery one. But our fort, because the original structure was designed for a different type of ammunition hoist, it had to do a front delivery ammunition hoist. The projectiles were brought in here. They went up the chain hoist and were delivered here on the delivery table, but both of these were on the same side. And again, the hoist system, this happens to be at Fort Moultrie at Battery Jasper. I'm pointing up to the trolley system there. That's the delivery or the receiving table, and the delivery table up on the loading platform where the projectiles would come out and go on the ammunition truck. And just a loading of a gun. Actually, I think this is a 12-inch gun. I just like the photograph because of the dog up here in the corner. But I'm told that this particular gun, or this picture, is at Battery Warren, which is up in the Harbor Defense of Boston. And this is just a diagram of the loading sequence. I've sort of plagiarized this from Fort Moultrie. And you can see the projectiles being moved by the trolley to the receiving table on the hoist, up the hoist, again, electrically powered hoist, to the ammunition truck or cart, and then brought to the gun for loading. Now, the 4.72-inch quick fires, these were made by the British company Armstrong. Interestingly, there are 3 different barrel lengths were at various places. And my thinking is that when we went to to Armstrong back in around 1880 or 1898, we were really looking for these, for anything. And Armstrong said, well, okay, we got a few of these and a few of these and a few of these around. And then we said, you know, who do we make the check out to? And so we picked them up. But anyway, a few of these still exist. And this one happens to be in a small town northwest of here, Danielsville, Georgia, and it's in front of their, what used to be their county courthouse. Here I am making believe I'm loading. The gun was loaded with a fixed charge. Here I have it's actually just a 3-inch case, but anyway, sort of making believe that I would be loading the gun. The ammunition was stored in a magazine in wooden crates. And we actually have some diagrams of the 4.72-inch crate. These happen to be 3-inch. They're at Fort Moultrie. But 2 rounds in a crate. The total up round was about 60 pounds. So, you know, about 120 pounds or so. You know, 2 people could probably pick one of these up. They were stacked in this way to allow airflow around the crates, because dampness was endemic in indica period magazines, as we know, and that way it would keep things dry. This is the fire control tower. Actually, it was also shown in our video. This is at Fort Mont, New Jersey. It's been completely restored, and interesting to go and visit there. Typically in a fire control tower, a azimuth sight, as this observer is working, and the depression position finding sight as this observer is working, and then his reader there that we're standing where he can read the dials. This is inside the tower. Again, myself in uniform there looking through the sight. This was down at the azimuth sight level, and actually the depression position finder was at one level above that. There were phone booths there and telephones to maintain communication with the plotting room and wherever else they had to communicate to. The plotting room where the data was received and the fire control information was put together to send to the guns. Basically a semicircular table and various people sitting around there to work with that, and guys with headsets on, getting the information from the people in the fire control towers. And then this is getting ready to fire a gun. The information came up by phone, and since things were kind of a little bit confusing and maybe a lot going on and a lot of noise, the information was written on blackboards, an azimuth information, and then there was also graphical way to put the range information, but that way the crew could just look over there and see what the numbers, and then also you would have some record of what was sent. And this is now this is, this is supposed to be a video here, and there it is. Okay.
Seacoast artillery, as refined by
It's
the
a little
early 20th century,
a little short video on
task,
the gun firing.
accurate results. Instead of the gunners aiming, the target was tracked by men at widely spaced observation posts, known as base end stations. The location of the target from the base end stations was relayed by phone to the plotting room, where, by trigonometric means, the target was tracked and firing coordinates for the guns were determined. The range, or distance, and the azimuth, or direction, was then transmitted to the gun crews to set the gun for fire. The guns shown in this short part of the harbor defense of the Columbia River. The powder and shell were brought up as needed from their storage corridors located below the gun platform. After firing, the recoil pushed the gun down behind the protective parapet. The breech was opened, the barrel swabbed clean, and a shell rammed home, followed by the powder bags. At the same time, the new azimuth and gun elevation were set. After the breech was closed and the primer charge placed, a trip was released and the large counterweights beneath the guns dropped, pulling the guns into firing position. A sharp gun crew could fire these weapons 2 times a minute at a range of about 10 to 14 miles. These are the 12-inch mortars of Battery Howe, part of the harbor defense of San Francisco. These guns are very similar to those which were here in Fort MacArthur's Battery Barlow-Saxton. The mortars fired...
Weight in the center would pull them up into this firing position. The man on the right in the ODs is the safety officer to assure that we didn't fire at the towing vessel. The man on the left is the gun pointer who receives the information from the plotting room as to where to point the gun. The force of the firing pushed the gun back down into the loading position. Here you see the gun going up into firing position. That was the gun on the far side. Now the gun on this side will fire. Pushes it back into loading position. We'll see the loading in just a moment. This is Battery Russell, a 10-inch disappearing Seacoast gun installed about 1900. Here the crew moves the projectile in on a cart, then puts in the powder. Then the breech is closed. Then the man puts in the primer, which is like a big firecracker that explodes the powder. Back into loading position. Again, the shell, which is too heavy to handle except by a cart. Then the powder. Close the breech, put in the primer, trip the gun. This is the guns firing again. These guns were not firing at the Japanese sub in June of '42 because not only was that at night, but the guns were ordered not to fire because the submarine was out of range. That was the gun on the far side firing. In just a moment, the gun on this side will fire and go back down into loading position. First the projectile, then the powder. Close the breech, put in the primer, trip the gun.
Okay, that's it. That folks recognize that a lot of that video that comes from the Coast Defense Study Group DVD that I got at some point several years ago, and we borrowed some of that. Hopefully it's all right. But anyway, actually my